In this presentation, I will tell about the variety of problems I have encountered with students' construction of hypothetical premises. As a teacher at a leading science university in Japan, I've noticed that there is a need for instruction in hypothetical premise construction with my students. I've also looked into the background literature on this subject, and I found that it's roundly agreed that novice writers do not use meta-discourse markers with sufficient frequency. Novice writers do not use meta-discourse markers with sufficient levels of appropriacy, and that they also lack sufficient frequency and appropriate levels of use used to specifically signpost argumentative structure, and that when they did, that in blind studies, this resulted in higher scores. Shintani and Aubrey, 2016, found that the structures of conditional statements are difficult for Asian students, including Japanese students, because of the variety of forms of conditional statements typically found in the languages of that region. Khatib and Gamper, also 2016, found that errors made by Thai students when constructing conditional statements resulted 16% in errors involving hypothetical premises, i.e., future predictive conditional statements, and problems with subject-verb agreement were also involved in 5 of the most prevalent of those error types. Bryant, 1984, identified conditional statements as a trouble source among Japanese ESL learners. However, his study examined only conditional statements involving imagined situations, such as a differently experienced past or a future event such as winning the lottery, and did not specifically examine future predictive conditional statements, i.e., hypothetical premises. With Ishikawa and Suzuki, 2016, there was a study involving 53 Japanese university EFL learners, wherein it was found that the participants tended to mistakenly confuse the verb patterns of the future predictive with those of the present counterfactual, which we'll discuss later. Conroe and Couples, 2013, also found a high frequency of errors among Japanese students in the composition of, again, counterfactual conditional statements. In my own recent research, participants were given instruction on the distinction between conditional statements and hypothetical premises via a self-made podcast and also through several self-made text reconstruction exercises. These were designed specifically for the teaching of the following directive. That is, hypothetical premises are to be written in a single sentence, 2-clause, if-then structure, where the if clause is in the present tense and the then clause is in the future tense, generated through phrases such as will plus verb or until. I tasked students to write on a topic which required that they form hypotheses or future predictive conditional statements involving a study of the well-known Monty Hall problem. If you don't know what that is, I can talk about that later during the Q&A, or you might look it up yourself later. It's a bit outside the scope of this short talk, but it's enough to say here that it demanded that students form hypothetical premises in their writing. When reviewing students' responses in these several contexts, I noted that there were frequent types of deviations from the constructions that I had instructed them to use. Number one in the table presented were responses that just really didn't respond to the task at all. They either focused on the method or they were just reported results, but they didn't hypothesize what they thought the results were going to be before the fact. Number two were incomplete constructions, and we'll look at some of those later. Sometimes they used the present tense when rather than if. 2.5 were slightly better, but still using the when rather than if, and they suggested a future tense rather than actually using the future tense. This was really interesting because the students would use expressions like the probability becomes or the percentage gets. So these were quite interesting because they were ways the students were constructing talk about the future without using the future tense, and I wondered why they were doing this. 2.75, and I'm giving them little higher numbers because these were getting closer to the ideal, but again using when rather than if. And in the second clause, the students were using modal verbs such as could, would, can, and will, which is better, but still an incomplete construction. Number three, these were getting markedly better. They used the if-then construction, and they also used the future tense, but they were a little incomplete in the construction, just not quite on par with the for. Now with the for, this was a perfect or almost perfect construction using the present tense in the first clause and the future tense in the second clause, and they were using the if-then construction that I had instructed them to use. They also used will be in the second clause. Here we see two examples of problems that come up quite a lot where students seem to misunderstand, or they seem to confuse the data itself that is produced from the inquiry for the hypothesis. And as you can see here, there's no two-clause construction, and it's in present tense in the first one. In the second one, there's present tense in the first half of the sentence, and there's a future tense in the second half, but it still does not have the complete construction that we would expect there to be, and there's no actual sense of a hypothesis here. Instead, it simply presupposes what the data is going to show without making any sort of claim about the future outcome itself. So in this slide, we've got two very interesting cases. I'd like to look at each of these a little more closely. The first one, if I change the cup this moment, I can choose the correct cup. The use of the word can here is very interesting because although it is in the present tense and not the future tense, which it should be, it suggests potentiality. We might add also here that the student is speaking in very general terms rather than speaking about the specific claims of what will happen with the conditions which are set in this particular experiment. The second quote down here is also very interesting. If you can guess only one cup 500 times, the probability approaches 1/3. Well, this is better because they are speaking in terms of a number of trials which are going to be carried out. It's in the present tense in the first half of the sentence, and again in the second half we see this sort of ersatz construction of the future tense through the use of present tense verbs that suggest a potentiality of the future with the word approaches. Japanese students will often also use the word becomes. The total becomes something. And I think this might be a result of L1 interference and the way the word narimasu, the Japanese word narimasu, to become, is used similarly in such cases. And in this slide, again, we see this construction with the if at the beginning in the present tense, and this suggestion of a future tense, this time in the negative sense with a cannot choose the correct cup. In the second example I have here, see another very interesting use of the expression has to. So this again is suggesting something that has to be done at a future time. So it's a sort of ersatz construction of the future tense without using the prescribed forms which were taught in the class. In this next slide, we see what I'm calling a type 2.75 deviating construction. Here the student has used the if construction in the first clause with the present tense, and in the second tense we see a deviation from the prescribed form with the use of the modal would end up choosing. It's not clear here why the student would use the expression of a would end up doing rather than the will do form, which was prescribed in the instruction. In this last slide, we have a case where actually the student has divided their expression into two sentences, but that notwithstanding, we can look at the construction with an if and present tense in the beginning, and in the second half, again, the suggestion of a future tense through the, in this case, very interesting, it is predictable that we can get. So it's very interesting that although the correct phrase will be or will happen or will do was taught many times explicitly in the class, for some reason the students seem really intent on keeping their sentences in the present tense. To summarize then, the teaching of the hypothetical premise, i.e. the future predictive conditional statement, is indeed more difficult than one might expect. The reasons seem to be L1 interference with the student's insistence on remaining in the present tense in the second clause with uses of verbs in the present tense such as becomes or approaches, or as in this last case with a present tense to be verb followed by an adjective, in this case predictable, which suggests a kind of futurity. The other reason for these deviant constructions seems to be a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about the function of the hypothesis. It seems reasonable to expect that better instructional methods regarding the construction of hypothetical premises should result in improvement, and it also seems reasonable to expect that explicit instruction about the purpose and function of hypothetical premises and hypotheses would also result in better argumentation by students involving conditional statements and predictive claims of outcomes.